Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. In today's episode, Jimmy Fennessy and I are talking to Paul Witcover, the Associate Dean for the online Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program at Southern New Hampshire University. He's here to talk about his recent novel, Lincolnstein, but we're also going to talk about historical fiction as a genre and the research skills necessary to write good historical fiction. What is your name and what do you do?
My name is Paul Witcover, and I do many things. I'm a writer, published novelist. I also am a teacher of creative writing, and currently I'm the Associate Dean of the online MFA program at Southern New Hampshire University.
Paul, could you give us a little bit of background on how you got to where you are? Obviously, there's the creative side for writing, but also the academic side. So interested to hear how you got there.
Yeah, I often think of myself as defined by that line in a replacement song. How does it go? One foot on the curb, the other one in the gutter. I came to academia. Now I don't know which of those academia qualifies as the gutter or the curb, but I came to academia.
Yeah, we can go back and forth on that.
Yeah, exactly. I came kind of accidentally. I've always been a writer and have kind of structured my career around writing. I've published 7 novels, I think, a collection of short stories. Done a lot of journalism, book reviews, critical pieces on literature, things like that. And it was kind of through teaching, which I began to do in order to supplement my income as a writer, that brought me to SNHU, and ultimately from there I became a team lead, which is kind of a post that involves being sort of a mentor to other instructors. And from there I became a dean. I almost accidentally, really, just because the previous dean was taking a leave of absence. They asked me to step in while she was gone, and she never came back because she decided that she was going to move in the opposite direction and concentrate on her own writing. And her first book came out and did very well, and her second book is coming out in the spring. Joan Smith is her name, a wonderful writer.
Yeah, Joan's really cool. We miss her, but we also, of course, are happy to have you on board.
Thank you for saying that.
And one of the reasons that we have Paul here talking to us today is that his most recent book is called Lincolnstein, and it just came out just this year, right? 2022.
Just about a year ago.
Oh, okay, it's 2021. Yeah. Okay, so this is a novel. It's historical fiction, involves Abraham Lincoln. So I don't want to do any spoilers here. So why don't you tell us about the book? What's a good starting point for understanding Lincolnstein?
Well, I can tell you how the idea came to me, which is that this is an idea that I had for many, many years, but I couldn't figure out how to write it, mainly because there are a lot of it's set during the very end of the Civil War, after Lincoln's assassination. There are a lot of important characters, and one especially who's a person of color. And I felt like as a white male writer, I didn't have the right really to write about that person's life and inner life. And it took me a long time to figure out a way to get into the story that felt legitimate to me and authentic and didn't feel like I was stealing something that didn't belong to me. And whether I succeeded or not, of course, is up to the reader to decide. But I felt, ultimately that I was able to tell the story. The story that I wanted to tell was there are all kinds of kind of apocryphal stories recounted by former enslaved persons about having seen Lincoln wandering about the roads and backwoods byways of the South. during, before, and after the Civil War. And it always struck me as incredibly interesting that people would recount having not just seen him, but had conversations with him. I write speculative fiction, and I began to think about, well, how could that possibly have happened? And I kind of devised, by stealing from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a way that maybe it could have happened if Lincoln was assassinated and the government had a means of resurrecting him. Would they have tried to do so? And that's kind of where the book begins. There are efforts to do that. Things go awry, and a kind of a hunt takes place across the South as an agent is dispatched to kind of recover Lincoln, or terminate Lincoln, who's no longer Lincoln. He's now has the personality of another person, another man, or to be more accurate, I guess their personalities are kind of mingled now, and it's hard to know exactly which one of them is prevalent.
Yeah, it's I just read the book over the last week or so, and it's I really enjoyed the book to start off with. It's I thought it was an interesting. I mean, again, I won't give anything away towards the end of the book or anything, but it does have an interesting. When I first saw the book and when I first heard about the book, I kind of jumped to the assumption that this was going to be like kind of a goofy book, like the Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the Seth Graham Smith, I think his name was, that he wrote like 20 years ago or 15 years ago.
Or like, so it's kind of some zombies.
Yeah, exactly. So I at first that's kind of what I was wondering, if that's what was going on here. But I was actually I liked that you played it straight in the book here. It's really not. I mean, there's some goofy moments here and there, but it's not it's not a slapstick send up or anything. It felt like you played it seriously. You took and you didn't really worry too much about the the science behind it. Like, basically when they do the thing where, like you said, where Lincoln's brain basically is replaced by another guy's brain, you don't spend any time talking about like the science behind it or how do they make it. You just basically just said it just did it. It just happened. And then let's move on with the story.
Not the real science. I mean, I could do a little hand waving there, and I do. I kind of hit the special effects button at that point, but try to blip over it as quickly and colorfully as possible.
Yeah, and so the rest of the book I thought was it was more serious than I expected, but that's good, because this is not a goofy vampire. It's not Lincoln doing superhuman acts with like broadswords and chopping off the heads of bad guys or anything. It's fairly, it's not medically accurate, but it felt like it was a realistic type situation. And so I thought that was an interesting twist to it that kind of colored my whole experience with the book a bit. And when you're saying that you were concerned about accurately portraying a former slave, we'll just put it that way. Well, let me ask you, how did you finally overcome your kind of hesitance about that?
Well, I realized that I could have my main character be a white person, basically, and I could engage with the history of a kind of the tendency of white people to speak for Black people, and white characters to recast a Black story as their own, and Black history as their own. And that became one of the central themes of the book, was the idea that the white person who thinks this is a story about them comes to discover that it's not their story at all, it's someone else's story. But I don't have access to that. I didn't feel. So I had to portray it kind of indirectly. And I had to devise some literary sleight of hand, I guess, in order to portray that in what I thought was a legitimate way.
Yeah, and it just so happens that one of the sections of the book that kind of jumped out at me, kind of along those lines, was on one of the pages you talked about. There was at one point the former slave lectures the main character a little bit about kind of about that white people tend to kind of put themselves as the victims in all of this. I was trying to think of what. Oh yeah, here we go. So they okay. So folks see me, they don't see no Abraham Lincoln. They see a black man. Ain't that something? It's like they got a sixth sense for it. And when white folks see a black man, why they don't see nobody at all? Just another N word. So that's how we're going to do it. You be the wounded hero, and I'll be the loyal bondsman, faithful yet despite the war, despite being set free. There ain't nothing you white folks like to believe in more than the idea of your own goodness. You will ignore all evidence to the contrary just to make yourselves feel better about all the evil that you have done or allowed to be done in your name. Sure, white folks pity a blind man, but that ain't nothing compared to the pity you feel for the real victims of this misbegotten world, your own damn selves. This is a story that you don't get tired of telling nor of hearing. I like that. And it's interesting that you just brought it up there too, because that was one of the sections that really jumped out at me, because it felt a little bit like there was, and there throughout the book, I felt like there were references to other kind of famous works regarding slavery, and so that felt a little bit like some passages from Uncle Tom's Cabin, where there's some sections in there where some of the white slave owners are a bit reflective on their situations compared to black slaves and all that. So I felt like there was some reminiscences there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a book that is engaged not just with the actual history of the United States during a particular period of time, but also with works of literature that were written about that period of time or around that period of time. It is in close conversation, I guess you could say, with Huckleberry Finn, with the works of Faulkner and many other writers. And there are little bits and pieces. Well, when it comes to Twain, of course, it's more than just a little bit, but there's bits and pieces taken from history and from literary history and all mashed together in the book. And that's one of the things I like about writing historical fiction, is the ability to do that.
Like, what helped you to capture that voice then? So we talked a lot about the literary influences that are there. Also wondering about the historical one. So you've got this source material of like literary history, but also history. So history. So what was your source material, and how did you kind of translate that to develop these characters and to develop this narrative? Was there a specific process, or was it a lot of first person narratives? Like, just interested in how you did that.
It's a mix, really, a mix of looking at works of literature that were written about that period. For example, Dr. O's book, The March, which I think is an incredible work of historical fiction set during that same period of time. And kind of mining source material like that for dialect, tone, things like that. I'm from the South myself, so I feel like I have I grew up immersed in the mythology of the lost cause, and I know what people from the South sound like and what they talk like. Also, primary source material. There was a lot of former slave narratives that were compiled, by the U.S. government in the WPA and prior to that. And I drew on a lot of those accounts, specifically the apocryphal recollections of meetings with Lincoln or sightings of Lincoln. And my novel is dedicated to 3 women, and all of them are former slaves whose primary source material I drew on at various points in the novel.
Yeah, you have those interstitial scenes, kind of like what
Yep.
between there's the main story, but then you have like you'll take a break and have a couple of pages.
And that's one of the literary sleights of hand that I was referring to earlier that allowed me to present this perspective, but not in an interior way.
Yeah, it did feel like it read a lot like the like you're saying, the WPA interviews from the New Deal, the slave narratives and all that. So that was an interesting way to do that. And then kind of going back to your literary connections, and Jimmy, you raised a good point about the history connections of it. It was interesting that there were so many of Lincoln's quotes from Lincoln's speeches just kind of scattered throughout the text, just kind of without really any, just all of a sudden someone would say mystic chords of memory and better angels of our nature and all those things that just kind of were Lincoln's, but sometimes they were even in the mouths of other people. There was a reference to a Frederick Douglass quote. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. That was from the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, probably some other places too, but that's the one where I remember it the best from. So, and I think that quote came out of the mouth of one of the slave owners, I believe. And so it's interesting to see these kind of quotes that are kind of floating throughout all the way down to us historically, but kind of popping up in the text of the story too.
I mean, that's the beauty of, for me anyway, of writing historical fiction, is that I can cut those things loose from their owners and use them however I see fit in the service of the story, hopefully still maintaining some connection to the history that spawned them.
The other thing that jumped out at me while I was reading it, that kind of getting back to your idea about trying to capture the story of former slaves and all that, was whenever the N word was used, it was you went with the N dash convention. Was that how did you make that decision? Because that's one of the things that we run into as historians all the time, is if I'm going to quote a slave owner or whoever, and it comes to that word, historians have kind of wrestled with this for a generation now. How do I use that word, even knowing that all the hurtful connotations, or do I put brackets N word, or what do I do? And so how did you settle on doing the N dash dash?
Yeah, this was something that I was very concerned about, and that I thought quite a bit about. And the solution to the problem, at least again, a solution that felt viable to me, occurred really in the very last stages of the book. It was probably in its ultimate draft. It had already been accepted by the publisher. It was back to me for copy edits. And it just occurred to me that, in the novels of that time, very often it was a convention, as you point out, for any kind of curse words or words that would not be acceptable in polite society to be represented that way. They would have like the first letter followed by a couple of dashes. And that struck me as a perfect kind of way to not only maintain fidelity with the idea, the conceit that this is a novel that is actually being written at the time, rather than something that's being written today. So it was true to the conventions of its period, but also it struck me as a useful way of kind of tying yet another way of tying the story and themes of the novel into to what's going on today, as you point out, not just in history, but in all forms of expression, really, like what's acceptable to use and to whom is it acceptable.
But yeah, and that's kind of what I figured happened there. And I thought that actually was kind of a clever way to do it, because you're right. There's all those old novels. Ironically, the N word usually was not censored because it was not quite as offensive to people's sensibilities at the time. But yeah, whenever they would say damned, it would be D dash 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 D or something. Yeah. So yeah, that was an interesting way to put the novel into kind of almost a historical lingo, I guess. There's probably a better word for that than lingo. But so you already mentioned the Huck Finn connection here. And I don't think it's a spoiler by saying that the main character, the white man that you were talking about, who became the main character of the book, his name is Huckleberry Finn. Now this is occurring in 1865. Twain didn't write that book until the late 1880s. So where did that come from? What was the choice to go with that naming with that? And there's some other familiar characters that pop up with from that.
I mean, this goes back again to my original conception of the novel, where I felt like I felt like I had a pretty good idea of whose brain was going to be put into Lincoln's body, and then it was just a matter of working out, the logistics of it. It's true that Twain didn't write his book until somewhat long after the Civil War was over, but it's set, prior to the Civil War by a number of years. So it was an educated guess on my part how old Huck Finn would be during the time of the Civil War and what pursuits he would be engaged in during the Civil War. But I think I feel pretty happy with how that part of the book turned out, actually. Those, Huckleberry Finn, the novel and the character and Jim, those are such an indelible part of American literary history, I think, and inseparable really from American history. I mean, this is one of those areas in which the two are just like, so closely intertwined that they're indistinguishable. That's really what gave me the courage, I think, or audacity, or whatever you want to call it, to think that as a white person I could write this book, because I felt like, well, this is the American story, and it's something that every American writer has a right to investigate in their fiction.
Was there anybody along the way that you kind of checked in with, just to check on, the way that the characters were unfolding, or the dialogue, or was this strictly from research, literary convention, and your own imagination?
Yeah, I'm the kind of writer that doesn't really show my work to anybody until it's finished. And then I check in with my agent, and I value their feedback highly. And a couple of other people I also pay attention to. But mostly I just kind of work in a vacuum.
And so I'd like to, I think at this point it's probably best, let's start talking about just kind of historical fiction in general. Because this is it's an odd category, obviously. I mean, it is oftentimes the authors of historical fiction kind of take great pains to show that they've done their research, they've done their the legwork to establish the proper historical context in which they're placing their story. So since you are the dean for the creative writing program and the creative writing or the MFA in creative writing, and that program, there is speculative fiction, like you mentioned, and historical fiction is kind of one version of that. And then I imagine other fields of that would probably be like sci-fi and fantasy and and things like that. But we'll stay focused on historical fiction for now, I suppose. So what are the kind of essential, what should people that want to write historical fiction, what should they know? I mean, what are the kind of things, the central teachings that you might have for someone that kind of is toying with the idea of historical fiction?
Well, I mean, you have to have a respect for history. You have to have an interest in and love of history. That was my minor in college. I feel like I could have gone that route instead of gone the route of being a writer, of fiction, that is. The thing about historical fiction that I really like about it, or one of the things I really like about it, is that, if you're the kind of writer like me who has difficulty with a plot, right? History provides you with the plot. If you're writing a historical novel, you have, and especially if you're writing one that includes some historical characters, you have to be accurate in not only how you depict those characters, but the various timeline and intersection of the timelines of the various characters all have to add up and line up with what is known to history. Unless you're writing some kind of, alternate history, in which case you have to be accurate in your history, but only up to a certain point. And then you take a sharp left turn and anything goes. But I mean, the main thing is I think it helps a writer of historical fiction to have some training in history, to know how to handle resources and where to find resources, and not necessarily how to use them, because the use of resources in fiction, historical resources in fiction, is obviously very different than it is in a standard historical text, in that I'm not providing any footnotes. I'm taking what I need from wherever I find it and using it however I want. But I still have a kind of an internal compass that I'm steering by in order to try to make everything add up and kind of remain true in important ways to the time about which I'm writing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, about your personal philosophy in relation to using history. Is it more of a guideline, and can you play fast and loose with maybe the dates or the decades or certain people? The latest season of The Crown comes to mind, the big controversy around that, that the argument that the writer or the director hasn't been as accurate to the portrayal of the Queen and the royal family as like historically accurate, and we have sources and data to show that this isn't accurate. And her response has been, well, it's true to the feel of what was going on at that time period. So is there a responsibility, and maybe it's not really a responsibility, but a personal choice for the artist to either stay true to the historical narrative and to make things fit within the timeline and the characters, or is it more of a guide, but you can play fast and loose with it, and there isn't really a sense that you're constrained by those historical elements?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, I really think it comes down to what the individual writer is trying to do. I think it's extremely problematic if you are sending signals to your readers that you're writing a straight up historical novel that is hewing as closely as possible to recorded events, and then suddenly you introduce elements that diverge wildly from that. It can certainly work, but you have to lay the groundwork carefully for something like that. Or if it's just clear right from the outset that you're just riffing on it, it's not a joke exactly, but it's all grist for the mill. It's all raw material for you to manipulate it however you like. Those kind of novels can be super fun, and meaningful as well. But it's a matter of consistency. I think it's important that if you're a writer, that you kind of let your reader know, here's the kind of book I'm writing. Here's what you have every right to expect, and then adhere to the rules that you yourself have made and laid down as the writer.
So it sounds like one of the big central kind of ideas that basically what everybody needs to do is make sure that they're just being internally consistent to what they're trying to do. They want, if you're going to go the tongue-in-cheek route, stay with the tongue-in-cheek route. If you want to go the serious route, keep it the serious route. Don't throw in some tongue-in-cheek stuff just halfway through, which might throw things off. I don't know. I mean, there might be situations where that would work. But
yeah, we can always think of exceptions to these rules. But I think by and large, consistency is extremely important.
Especially, and the honesty too is what you said, right? Like the honesty. So the loosely based on versus the caveat that this is loosely based on historical information versus we're staying as close to the historical information as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also often seemed to me that when you're talking historical fiction, there's kind of two levels of it in a way, where one is that, okay, I'm going to adopt a certain historical context and I'm going to create a story with all new characters that are going to kind of happen in this context, probably, I don't know, a small village in Prussia or something, which won't have much influence on the rest of the world. It's probably, they're not going to really be known to anybody. And so therefore I'm kind of safe by talking about these people that no one's ever heard of, but no one should have heard of these because they're, these are small, they're small stories in some remote area of the world, but we're going to focus on making sure that at least the context that they're living in is accurate. There seems to be that version of historical fiction. But then there's the other kind that just goes all out and grabs onto the world famous people, kind of like you did here with Lincolnstein. And I'm wondering, did you feel nervous at all about jumping onto Lincoln as your central historical figure here? I mean, by all accounts, Lincoln has the most words written about him of any person in humanity except Jesus. And so did you feel any nerves about taking on a topic like that in something that's so well known?
Because I mean, as you point out, so many words have already been written. What are my 50,000 words added to that?
Fair point. Okay.
But it's true that those are two very different approaches to writing historical fiction, and you know, one is essentially timeless in that, as you point out, you know, like it's that Prussian village. You know, is it set in 1870? Is it set in 1820? Is it set in 1917? I mean, there are like external historical factors that are going to be you know, impinging upon the lives of the people in this village, regardless of when you set it. But I think probably part of that story is going to be to express something timeless about the way life is lived in this village, right? That's very different from a story that's set, like, you know, in a particular place at a particular time for a particular reason, right? Because something happens on this date, and we want to introduce a cast of characters that's leading up to that date. Titanic, right? Or, you know, or you know, December 7th, you know, Pearl Harbor. We know, and of course, you're reading a novel like that, you know what's going to happen, right? It's not the suspense of like, wow, are the Japanese going to bomb Pearl Harbor? No, it's like the suspense lies rather in what's going to happen to these characters that we've come to grow very attached to.
So, or I guess there's the third option, which is where you just add in something that's kind of completely ahistorical, and to think about like the Harry Turtledove novel, The Guns of the South, where a machine gun was accidentally sent back in time to the Confederate Army, and they were able to destroy everybody because they had Uzis or something.
Then you're talking about, you know, alternate history or counterfactual, as the academic term for it is, right. But they're the same thing. And yeah, those are also incredibly interesting and fun to write and read.
Yeah, those what if histories. It was whenever I had to grade those papers, it was like always interesting to see where students would go with it, but it was a sense of, it would just infuriate me, because I was like, you're writing a historical paper and what you're doing is inserting all these speculations about what if something else happened, but you're a historian, so you need to go with what did happen so that you can then talk about the connections and how all of that played out. It was just history students always want to go down that route of speculation. And I always wondered if it was because they were bored with what actually happened. They didn't want to continue like doing the hard work of what actually happened, so they just wanted to speculate, or if it's just kind of human nature to speculate about things like, oh, this would be fun to think about, like what would have happened if, you know.
I think it is human nature. I mean, you mentioned Turtledove a minute ago. I mean, he's got a PhD in history. He's a trained historian. And what he does in his books is applies the historical method, but to imaginary events that take off from you know, actual recorded history. Something new happens. It might not be something as egregious as the introduction of a machine gun, but it might be. But then the rational, you know, mind of the historian once again takes over and extrapolates from that piece of information or whatever that's been introduced into the historical record to change it in some way, and then like extrapolates as logically as possible what the results would be. I think that's an exercise. It's like a armchair historian exercise.
One of the things you brought up earlier was, I think, some of the stories that inspired you to think about doing this project in the first place. So these various accounts of having seen Lincoln at various points, like along the road, and remembering conversations. I think about the Elvis phenomenon, right? No, Elvis didn't die. I saw him at McDonald's in 1982. He was ordering a Big Mac.
Right.
So what did you learn from your research in these areas? Obviously they probably weren't talking to Lincoln, but did you unearth anything, any deeper, either truth or understanding about how these things came about, or was it just sincere belief and in these situations that probably didn't happen because Lincoln wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that they didn't happen. But I mean, it's, these things were experienced by people who were enslaved. They had, their lives were all bereft of hope in ways that we can't really understand. Somebody like Lincoln, who for them represented the antithesis of everything that they had been forced to endure. What a powerful figure. I mean, it's really a religious thing, I think, as much as anything else, to want to see this person. It's like seeing Jesus. I mean, you mentioned that there's, other than Jesus, Lincoln has the most words written about him, but Jesus and Lincoln are very, very similar figures when you think about it. Their trajectories are extremely similar, and their effect upon their countrymen and women very similar. And I don't mean to overstress this similarity, but there are definitely similarities.
Well, Lincoln died on Good Friday.
That I did not know. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then he rose again in my book, anyway.
that occurred to me. I was wondering if you were going to go that route. But before I kind of understood that this was more like a kind of a straight take on it, I wasn't sure if you were going to kind of go down that road of the resurrection 3 days later, because there were certainly people, that would hope Lincoln would come back after. Okay, so what's next for you? Anything else on the horizon that is kind of, you're going to go the historical fiction route again, or are you going in other directions now?
More and more, I've been writing historical fiction. I mean, I've been writing. My first novel was what I call a science fiction novel disguised as a fantasy. My second novel was kind of the opposite. It was like a fantasy novel that was disguised as science fiction. And then I had this opportunity to write was offered to me to write a sequel to the Universal Monsters, movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, all those famous pictures. I was offered the chance to write the sequel to Dracula. So I did. And I set that in the closing days of World War I, in an asylum for victims of shell shock. Had to do a ton of research for that and a lot of primary source material. That's when I understood the utility of the scaffolding history provides for a story. And there too, I first kind of understood the way in which literary history could be merged with history in a work of fiction. And in that book, obviously I was stealing from Dracula, but I also wove a lot of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland stuff in there as well. And after that, I wrote a 2-book fantasy series. It's really a trilogy. The third has yet to be written. That's set during the 7-Year War in Europe. And that was a very different kind of challenge, historically speaking, because there was not so much primary source material for that war, and there was not so much beyond like the big set battles and things like that to work with. But nonetheless, I felt like that I had found my métier as a writer, and it had to do with historical fiction and bringing in literary history, mashing it up, and coming out with something new. And that's what I've more or less done ever since. And the book I'm working on right now is it's sort of similar in a way. I mean, it's set in a more recent history. It's like it's set in 1969, during the weekend of the moon landing. But that's still, at this point, that's still the deep dark past.
Yeah, that counts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. Looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. All right. Well, let's see. We always wrap up the episodes by going around and talking about our recommendations. So, Paul, what do you have for us here?
All right. So like I said at the outset, this is kind of a personal use of history. But as I was thinking about the terms of the question that you posed, it's what rose into my mind. So I'm kind of very interested in World War II history and the Nazis especially. And one of the books that has made a big impression on me when I first read it, which I guess is about 20 years ago now, is Victor Klemperer's diaries, I Will Bear Witness. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that book or not. It's a kind of a towering work of history. Klemperer was a Jew who was married to a Christian woman who lived in Germany and recorded his experiences throughout the Hitler years and beyond into, unfortunately, he was in the Soviet sphere after the war, so things didn't necessarily get that much better for him. But he saw what was coming with Hitler very early, and his avowed purpose in keeping his diary was, as the title of the diary suggests, I will bear witness. So when Trump was elected president, I felt like our country was treading down a very dangerous path. And I felt as though we were, in fact, recapitulating the steps that Germany had followed. And certainly that seemed to me to be a very present danger. So I turned to this book, which had provided me with so many insights into the history of Germany and into the mentality of Germans and Jews during that period of time. And I started, leafing through it, and I was struck that the calendar of those books aligned perfectly with our calendar. December 2nd, 1939 was the same as December 2nd. It was like a Tuesday, in 2020, in 2016 or whenever, right? So I realized that I had a blueprint here in Klemperer's diary for Trump's reign as president in this country. So I created a Twitter account called Witness Bear. And every day I would take a tweet out of Klemperer's diary and post it on Twitter. And it was incredible to see how often there would be just like a unbelievable, not just even a parallel, but like two layers just fitting together perfectly. It was frightening, but also fascinating. And I kept that up for the entirety of Trump's presidency until he lost. And then I think I kept it up until the transfer of power, which we almost didn't have. And then I laid it aside in hopes that I would not have to pick it up again. But of course, I yet may.
Yeah, I hope you don't have to pick it up again in 24.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that to me was just such a great example of the way. I mean, I'm a regular person, and here's a book that had meant a lot to me because of my interest in history. And yet current events unfolded in such a way that this book began to speak to me with a prophetic power. And that's what I was seeking to express to others through this Twitter account, which became, kind of like an exhibition in some way, right? It was not just a Twitter account. It was a creative expression.
Is that account still
Yeah.
online?
Yep.
I might check that out. I didn't know you were doing that. That's awesome. All right, Jimmy, what do you have to recommend this week?
So, as you know, I tend to focus a lot on pop culture and music and things that, I guess, if you follow the 20-year rule, are history. I'm really pushing it on this one. But another kind of dark period in American history with a lot of bright spots too. So in 2017, Lizzie Goodman wrote this book called Meet Me in the Bathroom: Rebirth and Rock and Roll in New York City from 2001 to 2011. So the darkness that I'm talking about is obviously the specter of 9/11 looms large. Not so much more so in the documentary. So what I wanted to talk about was actually Will Lovelace's documentary of the same name based on that book, Meet Me in the Bathroom. And it's a really great look at the music scene in New York in the early 2000s. So we're talking the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, the Rapture, the Moldy Peaches, obviously the Strokes, LCD Sound System. So it's a fascinating look at these people who came together, kind of similar to what happened in the late 70s in New York around with the punk scene, and then the transition of that in a city where a music scene for the most part had gone. Obviously, you have the rise of rap in the late 80s and in the mid 90s, but guitar music for the most part was gone. Things had shifted in New York City. So this is really about the rise of that happening again. It's another similarity to punk. You have something very similar happening in England at the same time, with guitar music coming back to the fore with bands like the Libertines. So in the 70s, you have this punk movement happening in New York with bands like the Ramones and others, but you also have the counterpart on the other side of the pond with the Sex Pistols and the Clash and stuff. So it's a really great documentary that delves into what's going on with these bands, but also the larger world the larger world of New York City and the music scene at that time. So highly recommend the documentary. It's worth the 2 hours of your time, and then you can go back and dive into Lizzie's book.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. I'm going to definitely check that out. I mean, I was living in New York through that period. I saw a lot of those bands. I mean, not the early punk bands, because I didn't get to New York until the early 80s, but I definitely saw all those other bands. What a great time to be in New York. It's not like that anymore.
No, I was having conversations with my friends. I grew up in upstate New York, but was in New York City a lot, especially after 2001. My cousin had moved down there. I was living in San Francisco, but was living cheaply enough at that point that I found myself spending, a week at a time on his couch every other month, skateboarding and going out. And that seems so interesting because there's this awareness that's developing within, I guess that would be those of us in, what would that be, Gen X at the time. So, but there's also this like grittiness to it. So there's this growing awareness of, of race, of sex, of like all of these forces in the world. But there's also this malaise that, seems to be there with Generation X, that if you look at the current generation, they're just, I don't know if there would be that same type of approach to music and the world, just because of how our mindset and how the world has changed. But yeah, New York at that time period was a lot of fun, probably too much fun.
Yeah, that's cool. The book is really interesting, and I didn't know there was a documentary about that. That's cool. I'll check that out too. All right, I'm going to recommend. Well, there's a couple recommendations, kind of all tied into one, I suppose. One is that a week or so ago, my wife was watching the Community episode on Pillows and Blankets, which is the kind of the parody of the Ken Burns Civil War series. which is an amazing episode, probably one of the best episodes in the series. So that's a recommendation right there, is to check out the Pillows and Blankets episode on Community. But after seeing that episode, my wife asked if I wanted to, track down and watch the actual Ken Burns Civil War series. And of course, yeah. So, recommendation number 2 is to find a wife that's as big a nerd as you are, I suppose. But so we found the DVDs at the library, at the, our city library, and watched it from start to finish. And I don't think I had ever actually watched the thing from start to finish. It's an amazing series. It's deserves all of the awards and accolades that it has earned over the years. It's an amazing piece of documentary filmmaking. Totally groundbreaking in 1990. It's a little, it might be a little bit cliche today, but back then this was cutting edge. This was amazing stuff. And it's a great series. But the amusing part was watching it with my wife, who's not a historian by any means, and only knows the stuff in from the Civil War that I've talked to her about. And one of the things that she and I have often talked about was Ulysses S. Grant and his attitude towards warfare, which is that I have all these resources and I'm going to crush you until you die, regardless of how long it takes, no matter how much blood is spilled, I'm going to just crush you because I have more resources than you do. And so it was interesting to watch the series because Grant doesn't really come on the scene until halfway through the war. The first half of the war was a string of just Union Army bumbling. They had, 2-to-1 for soldiers. They had umpteen times the amount of resources, wagons, food or uniforms, and they were just utterly incompetent. And so my wife just kept getting more and more frustrated the whole time, thinking, God damn it, why are these people so incompetent? Why is this war dragging on so long? When does Grant get here? And so I had to keep telling her that, well, no, Grant's coming. and every now and then in the series, they would see and then at this point, Ulysses S. Grant was, he was still drunk at this other obscure posting and was playing no role in anything. And Lisa would be trembling with rage, waiting for when he's going to come on the scene. Because she has that same attitude towards solving problems, is that, cut your losses if you're going to lose, or crush it with overwhelming odds. And so, we always joke about the old movie Black Hawk Down. And she always says it was an utter waste of resources to send guys to go in to retrieve the bodies of the dead soldiers, because all you're doing is creating more dead people. And so we often joke about Black Hawk Down whenever she's being unsentimental about something. But finally we get to the point in the Civil War where Grant comes in, and from that point on, she was just cheering because, yes, he's finally nailing those Confederates to the wall. And so I guess that's a recommendation, is just watch the Civil War with my wife. But the thing that was interesting about that series to me, it was created in 1990. Which means that the overall interpretation has changed a little bit since then. And the thing that kind of drove me nuts about the series, though, was its emphasis on using a historian. He's not really a historian. He was a writer named Shelby Foote, who wrote a very popular kind of narrative history of the Civil War. He was, I'm sure you all have seen seen him in the Civil War, but he's the Southern gentleman. He's got the drawl. He's got an amusing anecdote that is kind of relevant to what they're talking about at that moment, but also not really. But he has all these he's kind of the color commentator, but the thing that kept driving me nuts is that he is, even for 1990, he was representing such an old interpretation of the Civil War. One of the first things he says is that the Civil War was a failure to negotiate. It was a failure to compromise. And of course, any historian, even before 1990, historians were like, this isn't a compromise thing. What's the compromise when it comes to slavery? Do you allow it or not allow it? There's not really a way that you can compromise on that. But yet he was this writer who was, and this kind of became one of the themes of the entire series, was, look at this tragedy that could have been avoided if only North and South had, talked to each other. And he was just so frustrating.
That's so
So
ridiculous.
that's the
As though
part of
there
it.
wasn't a compromise in place that eventually led to this because there could no longer be a compromise.
I know, exactly.
Forget about that
Let's see,
compromise.
1820, 1850, Kansas, Nebraska. Let me keep going with. There were a lot of. So anyway, that's the part I don't recommend. I guess is the Shelby Foote parts of that series, but the rest of it is amazing, and so I encourage everybody to go check it out.
He became the breakout star of that series. It reinvigorated interest in his popular histories and in his novels as well.
Yeah, and then unfortunately, he also was a huge fan of Nathan Bedford Forrest.
He was.
Who, as you know, was one of the first Grand Masters of the KKK, and so there's some problems there too. But
he makes an appearance, or at least is mentioned in Lincolnstein.
Oh, was he? I missed that.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. I need to go back and find that now, because just so I can curse the heavens. Anyway, the Civil War. I'm not going out on a limb by recommending the Civil War because, of course, everybody in the world recommends that Civil War series. But
what a bold recommendation!
I know, isn't it? Really, I'm really going out on a limb here. So that's my recommendation. So,
although recommending that we come watch it with your wife.
I'm surprised it was from 1990. I thought it was much older than that.
I thought it was like mid 80s, but yeah, it's copyright 1990. I mean, maybe it broadcast before then, and that's just maybe the copyright that maybe it was renewed in 90. I don't know, but late. Yeah. I'm sure they were writing it throughout the late 80s. It was a huge undertaking,
yeah.
But
yeah.
It's an old vision of the Civil War that when I was in grad school and I took my first readings in Civil War history class, the teacher pointed to that specific interpretation that it was a failure to compromise. And she kind of put that as this is the old way of thinking. There was like the states' rights crowd back in the turn of the 20th century, the Dunning School and all of that. But the group that took the place of that, who didn't want to go all the way and say that it was the fault of slavery, they kind of found this as a middle ground, is that, it's just a failure to compromise. And it's just such a frustrating perspective. But granted,
that was their time.
Right. But granted, the thing was, that series was made like 35 years ago. So how much can I complain about it? But still, that was my sticking point. So anyway, that's that. So Paul, thank you so much for agreeing to come talk to us for a while. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, great to meet you, Paul.
This was fun. I appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening today. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Lyceum, SoundCloud, Podbean, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. If you have any questions or comments for this or any of our other podcasts, send us a message to workinghistorians@gmail.com or through our Twitter feed @workhistorians. For Jimmy Finnessy and Paul Witcover, I'm Rob Denning. Happy Lincoln hunting.